Sure, all eyes are on the NBA Finals that finally began last night after too long of a break, but don't let it distract you from the fact that the NBA draft is quickly approaching. And shame on me here on Locked On Kings. We barely talked about it. Well, we're correcting that today. Richard Stayman, one of our draft experts here on the Locked On Podcast Network, joins me to break down this draft class, some names to consider with the 13th overall pick, his thoughts on the Kings potentially trading 13 and the value of that pick, and more right here on Locked On Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all off season long. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to get started. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I'm a Sacramento sports anchor and reporter for ABC 10 News, and I've worn this with full transparency. I was not expecting at all to be interested in this draft. Why? Because I was not expecting the Kings to have a draft pick. I was expecting this pick to convey to Atlanta as part of the Kevin Huerter trade. I was not paying attention to this draft class at all this year. Call it arrogance, call it cockiness. Matt, you cover and follow and are a fan of the Sacramento Kings. How in the world could you be that arrogant? No idea, but I'm paying for it now. The good news is the Locked On Podcast Network is loaded with experts, not just for your local teams, of course, but in the draft. And Richard Stayman is one of those experts. Always excited to be able to talk to him. I think you're really going to like and not like some of the things that he has to say. If you put a lot of fuel into the conversation that I had with the Locked On Wizards podcast about a potential Kyle Kuzma trade involving the 13th overall pick, he might quiet that down with his opinion on what he thinks 13 is worth. But if you're a fan of Zach Edey and you think that he could be someone for the Sacramento Kings to keep an eye on, Richard has some things to say about Zach that might excite you. Also, Richard talks about our Sacramento boy, Jared McCain. There's so many different areas, routes that this conversation goes, all focused, of course, on the draft from the Kings perspective and the general draft perspective. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Richard Stayman. Man, the NBA draft is coming up fast. 19 days away from day one, round one. And of course, the Sacramento Kings still find themselves with the 13th overall pick. I question whether or not they will actually make a selection for themselves with 13 on draft night, but that's a conversation to be had. Amongst this conversation with Richard Stayman, one of our draft experts here on the Locked On Podcast Network. You can find him on social media at Mavs Draft. Richard, very excited to talk about this draft with you. Honestly, I was not expecting coming into this offseason to care at all about this draft. I was hoping that this draft pick would convey to Atlanta as part of their Kevin Huerter deal so they could get that out of the way, which meant the Kings would have been a playoff team. But here we are. Having a lottery pick is never a bad thing necessarily. But I wanted to talk to you first and foremost about the label for this draft that I've seen that's been pretty common, this weak draft label. Do you agree with that label, or is that more about the top of the draft compared to last year with Victor Wembanyama and years past with Zion and Ja at the top of the draft? I remember the Tyrese Halliburton draft being labeled kind of a weak draft, and Sacramento ended up with Tyrese at 12. So I always like to dive into the mind of our draft experts first and foremost about the concept of a weak draft and what constitutes a weak draft and whether or not you feel this class is in that category.
Yeah, I think ultimately yes, but it's not like we've seen some really bad classes. I think it's a little bit better than 2013. With 2013, though, we had the hindsight bias of knowing Giannis and Rudy Gobert turned out to be like Hall of Fame level talents.
Right.
So I think that's going to be a little bit different, but the average class produces several all-stars. Like there's a lot of good players to be had, and they have to be spaced out throughout drafts. Of course, it's tough being sandwiched next to 2023, where you had Wemby headlining it, and the whole class was just loaded. Then the next year, people are already looking ahead. We know Cooper Flagg, Ace Bailey, Kamon Maglowak, Dylan Harper, those kind of guys, Trey Johnson even. Like, that's 5 guys that probably would go number 1 this year. So it's a little bit tough when you're putting yourself next to that. And this is the class most heavily affected probably by COVID. 4 years ago, these kids were all first-year high school, and that is one of the most important years of development. You miss out on it. So I think because of that, this is going to have some weird hits at random spots, like just because of all the anomalies that go around this class.
I'm trying to spin this too much in a positive light from the Sacramento perspective, but I feel like on drafts like this where they aren't super heavy at the top, there's value to be had, or there's maybe a slight bigger advantage to be had at being later on in the lottery, because you can maybe have a better option or better opportunity to find that diamond in the rough. Of course, you'd rather have the highest pick, the better, right? So you can have a better choice of whoever you want in this draft. But I feel like if you're going to be 13 in a draft, and 13 has conveyed some very, very impressive players over over NBA's history, even recent history, guys like Donovan Mitchell. You have Devin Booker, who was taken 13th. So there's talent to be had at that spot. But I feel like compared to maybe last year, Sacramento being at 13 this year, it's a little bit better. Is that too much of a spin?
I think here's the best way I would put it. 13 this year could definitely get you a good player. I have from my 6th ranked player, maybe 7th to 19, they're all on one tier. So you're right in the middle of that. That is actually the exact middle. I didn't even realize that when I was saying that, where the Kings picked 13th. So they, in theory, have about 12 different guys that they could target. So I think there are a lot of good players there. And also, I mean, who knows with Nikola Topic falling, like he partially tore his ACL. Yeah, it's a risk nobody wants to hear. They could go long-term in that route. I don't like it necessarily, but it is something where if you want to give 1 year off and then see what happens the next year, you could do it. But again, I think there's too many risks with the surrounding roster, but somebody else could do it in theory, just talking big picture.
So I'm also hoping that what we're talking about, 13 being a value spot, is the case, because Richard, I don't expect or want Sacramento to take a player at 13. I'm of the belief that adding a rookie to this roster, it's not a bad route to go. It's better than not having anything at all. But I'm of the belief that this Kings team is in win now mode. I mean, they've basically said it themselves. They're in win now mode, and they're looking for talent that's ultimately going to help them get back into the playoff picture and elevate themselves, hopefully soon, to legit contendership status in the Western Conference. And expecting that from a rookie is difficult enough. They did that with Keegan, but Keegan was a 4th overall pick in a strong draft, right? Not 13 in a weak one. So to me, adding a rookie, while I do understand the benefit of if you get a player and you have contractual control and they're cheap, especially when you're looking to pay Keegan and looking to pay Fox down the road, I understand that argument. But the financial argument doesn't outweigh the talent argument, and this Kings team just needs win-now talent. So my belief is that they won't make a selection at 13. Before we dive into the potential of the Kings trading 13 and the value of that pick, I'm just curious your opinions on teams that trade out of the draft, and if historically that works out well for teams, or just in your opinion, the risk versus reward factor of trading out of the draft for a more established talent.
Yeah, I think it depends. If you have multiple picks, it's probably okay. If you are actually, I know, so for those who don't know, I'm Maps draft, right? So in 10 years ago or 11 years ago now, which just not feel right to say, the Mavs had the 13th pick in 2013. Donnie Nelson wanted to take Giannis. They said, hey, we're going to save our money for free agency, move back to the 18th pick, take Shane Larkin. They also passed on Kelly Olynyk, who would have been a fine outcome, and then said they took Shane Larkin. So I have been scarred by this exact scenario personally. Like, I remember when I was younger and not in the business yet, like it was much harder for me to swallow that pill. So sometimes you get that, but other times I'm sure there have been success stories that I can't think of many off the top of my head where there's like some immediate win out of it, especially getting somebody because they sacrificed that pick. But I think if you get creative enough, it's not something that I would say is impossible. I feel like I'd rather trade back, but also everybody in this class wants to trade back. Every team is trying to sell their pick.
And that's where I think, like, I have one trade in mind, a trade that I've actually discussed with the Locked On Wizards podcast, and this is a trade conversation that's been happening here in Sacramento for a little while. The possibility of using 13 and some players to go out and get a Kyle Kuzma type player from the Washington Wizards. In my mind, I mean, there are risks to that from the Kuzma side of things and from the Kings side of things that we don't necessarily have to get into, but talking about using the value of the 13th overall pick, specifically giving that pick to the Wizards, who have 2, and then they move back into the lottery. So they have 2 shots at lottery picks in a year where they're going into a rebuild. I think it makes a lot of sense for them. But I guess, what's your overall opinion or gauge on, like, the value of a 13th pick and the idea of, if we're it never works this way, but if you're playing a game of NBA 2K and you're trying to translate like player to player, right? Does the 13th pick equal a role player? Does the 13th pick equal a low end starter? What do you think, like, that the value of the end of the lottery pick is to some of these teams that maybe are looking to move into it?
Yeah, in this class, I don't think it's going to yield much. It's going to be a pretty cheap price, I think, to move up steadily. Like, I went on Locked On Thunder. I was telling Rylan how you can move up from probably 12 to 6 without sacrificing that much. And obviously the Thunder are a special exception, but that's besides the point. I don't think they would do Kuzma to move up 12, 13 spots. So it would probably take future picks to do so and probably be a post-draft trade.
Like I said at the top of the show, today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. It is winner take all time in the NBA and NHL. FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. All you have to do is put $5 on the line and pick something that is a massive favorite to win, right? Find a bet out there, any bet, win that bet, and here's $150 in addition to what you win from that wager you placed to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Whether you're betting on the NBA Finals, betting on the Stanley Cup playoffs, betting on baseball, you can even bet on the NBA draft, where certain players are going to go. You can do that all on FanDuel. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. Let's talk about options of if they decide to make selections, because like you said, there is talent in this draft. Drafts always there's always some all-stars to be had, and doesn't necessarily always mean that those all-stars are coming at the top of the draft. So let's talk about this 13 range for you. First and foremost, like, on your board right now, who is sitting at 13? Whether it's a good fit for the Sacramento Kings or not, if you're looking at your 13th best talent, who is that guy?
I actually really like this pick. It's Tristan da Silva from Colorado. He's a pretty do-it-all wing. I think he grew a lot this year as a player, because last year I thought he was a shooter who had other skills. Now I see him as more well-rounded wing. Defense is a concern. I think he might struggle there pretty early in his career, because he struggled a bit this year. It was very inconsistent. He's kind of stiff, but the shooting is very real. The passing out of drives and passing off, like using his shooting as gravity to make everybody else around him better, is good. The rebounding is good. I think he's a good finisher for what he does. I think an NBA spacing his game's going to pop off.
Okay, so I'm glad you brought up a wing, because that is essentially what the Sacramento Kings are looking to bolster, period, this offseason. Not just in this draft, but just in general. Like, this team needs wing help. So it excited me that immediately you have a wing in that position. Before we talk about more names, let's talk about that position as a whole. Wings versus guards versus bigs. Is any one of those positions higher or better than the other, you think, in this class?
Well, right when the range Sacramento's picking in, there's a lot of different wings. I don't think Dalton Connect will be there, but Nikola Topic is a guard, but he has point forward skills. You have Jalen Tyson, who went to Cal. I know he's worked out with Sacramento. Tristan da Silva is a wing. Tijon Salon technically is a wing, but he might go higher. There's Jalen. Well, actually, this guy's probably too much, but Cody Williams. Pacome Dadier, I think he's somebody that could potentially sneak into the lottery. He's really rising, I think. I think there's a good amount of wings to choose from. I personally would go with Jalen Tyson. He's my highest ranked likely available wing. But if Dalton Connect is there, like he's somebody like when you said, rookies really don't add, I think Dalton Connect is that big exception to the rule. He's older. He's 22, 23, really late bloomer, grew before right as he went to community college. Then he went to Northern Colorado, grew to his 6'7" frame. And now he is the SEC player of the year, the reigning SEC player of the year. I think he's somebody that could easily impact winning for the Kings and do exactly what Kevin Huerter was supposed to do this year.
Is he a guy that if I'm looking for an archetype more than a name, I'm looking for that conventional 3-and-D style wing? I mean, it's what the Sacramento Kings are looking for, probably in a role-playing role. You're looking for someone who can space the floor, but also lock down on defense. I mean, every team in the league wants more of those guys, but the Sacramento Kings need more of those guys. Any names that fit that bill?
Yeah, not Dalton Connect. I would say Jalen Tyson's not like if you're looking for a pure 3-and-D, it's tough. I would say Pacome Dadier could be taught that, but he's probably a reach at that point. I think those guys are more readily available past 20. I have some of those guys ranked in my top 20, but there's no chance they're actually going to go there. But if you're looking for somebody who's going to be a two-way wing, Jalen Tyson's your answer.
What about perimeter defense? Sacramento's perimeter defense was really, really bad, and it's been bad for a while. My personal feeling on the issue or on the situation is not that the Kings lack with guard defenders. It's that they lack with size. Like the Kings have Keon Ellis. They have Davion Mitchell. They have De'Aaron Fox, who led the league in steals. So you have guys at the guard position that can guard on the perimeter, but the problem is these are 6'3", 6'4" max guys. In Davion Mitchell's case, he's 6 feet tall, trying to close out on threes. Shooters are just shooting over the top of him, so it doesn't really matter. So the Kings are getting torched with 3-point defense because they're just not long enough. They're just not tall enough to disrupt those shots. So if you're looking for guys on the wing that can help with the perimeter defense, with the length to and the wingspan, not just to disrupt shots, but maybe to cut off passing lanes as well. Any guys maybe in the with their measurements of the draft combine or anything that jumps off the page?
Yeah, so the rumor with this guy is that he got a promise in the top 10, and I actually think it's pretty true. If that ends up not mattering because they're having guys who get promised and they don't actually take them because someone else better was available, like teams promise players all the time. It's not that big of a deal, but I do think if Devin Carter is available, he is the exception to that rule of, yeah, he's small. He's 6'2.5" without shoes, but he has a 6'9" wingspan, son of Anthony Carter, who played in the NBA, by the way. Mm-hmm. Arguably the best shot blocking guard in the class. Actually, I'd say it's no contest. It is him, not arguable. And somebody like him could be what Davion Mitchell was supposed to be. The issue again is I just don't know if he's available. There are other guys where I look in the 20s where I'm like, this would be a really good pick. Kevin McCullough is a great example. He grew a lot on offense this year. Arguably the best perimeter defender in the country heading into the year. I really like his game. There are some European guys out there that could do it. There are some longer guards, but all these guys are end of the first, late first, early second, more than in this 13 range. So if I was Sacramento personally, if I'm trying to fulfill those needs, I would be okay moving back into the 20s because the drop off again, like I said, 7 through 19 is the same tier. A lot of those guys, even in other tiers, may go up and vice versa. Some guys in the other tier may go up before somebody's going to fall to them.
I have to ask you about Jared McCain, Sacramento product, of course, Duke Blue Devil. And I've seen some people mock him to Sacramento, one, because of the Sacramento ties, of course, but two, because of, and I think this is foolish, Richard, and I've seen this a lot with a lot of different draft breakdowns, but the Kings looking into the draft to draft a guard to replace Malik Monk, who could potentially leave in free agency. I think that's silly, not because they won't need to replace Malik, but that you're not going to find a Malik Monk replacement in this or pretty much any draft unless you're at the very top of it, right? Expecting any rookie to do what Malik Monk did and be as important as Monk was to the Kings, it's just silly. So if the Kings are going for a guard, it's because they feel it's the best talent at that spot. It's not because they're looking to replace Malik. That being said, Sacramento product. The Kings, Sacramento fans, we have pride in our area and want to see this young man succeed. What do you think about him? I don't necessarily expect the Kings to be too interested with him at 13. I don't even know if he's going to be there at 13. But just your overall feel on the Sacramento boy. Yeah,
so I like him, and I agree about the Malik Monk element. No rookie's doing that. and he may do it in a few years, but Malik Monk is a tough player to replace, I think, when you're picking outside of the top 10. So with McCain, the jump shot is perfect. Like, I think he has the prettiest jumper of the entire class, and it has the success to show for it too. Like, it's very real and going to translate. He's also sneaky quick for a guy who didn't, like, he was mostly deemed an off-ball player. And a lot of these off-ball players, they don't blow you away with athleticism if they're not a primary cutter, right? These off-ball shooters, you think of them, you hear Duncan Robinson, like Robert Covington, things like that. Those guys are not blowing you away with athleticism. But Jared McCain's pretty quick. He can get off the ground pretty fast. I do think he would be the best candidate to be a Malik Monk. My concern with him is he's 6'2", 6'3" wingspan, and he's not a point guard. I don't buy the defense coming around. So there's too many liabilities. Also, he's pretty old for a freshman. He's going to be 21 about halfway through the season. So there are some concerns with that. I don't know if you're truly trying to find Malik Monk, which I think is a terrible approach to the draft. He is your best candidate. Do you want to do that though? I don't buy it.
Every draft expert is wrong a lot of the time, but every draft expert has that one or two moments where they're like, I told you so, man. I told you so with some of these players. If we're fast forwarding 4 years into the future and you think there's going to be an I told you so guy in this draft, it could be at the top, could be anywhere where you think, man, this player is going to translate. This player is going to be very, very good or have a very successful career. Doesn't necessarily have to be an all-star. You could be a super, super successful role player that a team got at the right spot. Who's that guy just in this draft class that you think, man, 4 years from now, we're going to be looking back and going, how did he fall this far?
So it's funny. I have two of my biggest success stories were those kind of guys. One was picked 13th, and that was Donovan Mitchell. That was when I first started doing this publicly. I had him as a top 7 player. Probably should have been higher in hindsight. It's technically wrong.
Richard, can I cut you off there for a second? Because that's what drives me nuts about that freaking draft is that's a good draft for the Kings because they got Fox at 5, but they had 10.
They still did it right.
Fox was great at 5. But they had 10, and Donovan was right there, and they decided to trade back and take Justin
Jackson. Oh, I was not a fan of him. I loved the 2017 draft because I did not like the Dennis Smith Jr. pick for the Mavs. I did not like Frank Ntilikina. I was happy they didn't get him. Then they eventually got him. But at least you were not the Denver Nuggets who took Tyler Lydon instead of Donovan Mitchell. So Tyler Lydon played 1 year in the NBA.
But
so
God, the Kings
at least you didn't do that. But
the draft still pisses me off, even though they got Fox. That's crazy. Anyway, carry on.
No, it's frustrating when you could have batted 1,000 and like an easy one was right there for you. But the other one that I hit on, I had Desmond Bane 2 years before he was even on the radars. Like that was something where I was like, I told everybody I could about this guy, and people were like, well, he shoots weird. And that was everybody's counter. They're like, he looks like a trebuchet. Fine. But for this year, I would say I have 2 guys. One I'll say could be an all-star. And I'm not going to count Jalen Tyson, who I think actually does fit this because he's still mocked in the 20s. I don't understand that. He should be in the lottery. Excluding him, who is probably one of my top answers, but we already talked about him. Carlton Carrington out of Pitt. I think when you look at some of the stuff that he needs to fix, especially on the defensive end, gets fixed with NBA coaching and strength, like just growing into his body. He's super young. He's still 18 years old. I'm very high on him. And then the other would be Deron Holmes out of Dayton. He did everything for that Dayton squad. He's extremely productive per minute, per possession. They ran a very slow offense. He did everything for him. If the jump shot doesn't even translate, he's still going to be a good player. The jump shot's an icing on the cake. I know the work ethic is very strong. Just all the intel on him is great. I've seen him mocked in the 50s for months until very, very recently. I think he's going to be a first-round pick that really, really overachieves his draft slot.
Today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is also brought to you by BetterHelp. Look, we all carry around different stressors, big and small. When we keep those stressors bottled up, it can start to really negatively affect us. It can be harmful. Therapy is a safe space to go to get things off of your chest and to figure out how to work through whatever is weighing you down. It's more than just talking to somebody and then leaving and still dealing with it. Therapists help you dissect and unpack the things that are weighing you down and teach you and help instill in you both the confidence and the skills that you need to handle those daily issues. Problems big and small, right? A lot of people think, hey, I need to have some pretty serious trauma. I need to be going through something really, really tough. I need to have something from my childhood or a relationship issue or something to go to therapy. That's what it requires. No, you could have any little issue that is bugging you, that is weighing you down. In fact, I encourage everybody to talk about your life with a licensed therapist, a professional that will help you understand what you're going through better. And like I said, give you the skills to be able to cope with it going forward. A good therapist will help prepare you to be better outside of the office, so you have to come into the office less and less and less. But here's the best part about BetterHelp. Going into the office, you don't need to do that anymore. You don't need to find a therapist that's down the street that you need to take time off of work or in your afternoons or evenings to drive down and go and see. BetterHelp is completely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Get it all off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. Of course, a name that's been talked about a lot. It's going to be talked about even more building up to draft. And on draft night, a lot of people are going to be paying attention to where this guy goes. It's Zach Edey, of course, the big man. I'm curious what you think, how you think his game can translate to the NBA. When you have size like that, naturally you're going to be polarizing. Of course, what he did in the tournament speaks for itself. But if you're looking at typically a position and the size that when they have a lot of hype, unless they're like a super unbelievable talent like Victor Wembanyama, typically it's tough for them to live up to that potential. You see him mocked typically outside of the lottery. So guys seem to have a kind of realistic understanding of who he can be as an NBA player. But just your overall opinions on him, because there are some Sacramento Kings fans that even with Domantas Sabonis wouldn't mind having him as a backup.
Yeah, so a few things with him. I heard at the Combine, the lottery talk was pretty real from NBA people. Things have changed, I think, because I haven't seen him mocked in the lottery for a little bit. So I think that might have died off. But at the moment, like there has been real traction. That's not just like fan fiction, right? So I think that is real. Now with Edey, there are a few ways I see it. One, if he went to somewhere, somebody told me this and I thought it was fantastic, of if he went to the Spurs, like that could break basketball. I'm not quite there yet, but it is a very interesting idea. Like, how do you stop it? But I also think he's a 20 minutes per game guy that does damage, like a glorified Boban. But Boban wasn't like some bum. Like at the end of the day, he played playoff minutes against the Clippers, like real playoff minutes just 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. So that is something where it's like there is value and you have to change how you game plan. But the other thing on the other end of him, like opposite of him being teammates with Wemby, is I also heard this at the Combine. Somebody told me they're like, teams are going to overdraft players, especially big guys, because you have to stop Wembanyama. The same way a bunch of wings were drafted in all of LeBron's time because everybody wanted to stop LeBron. Everybody wants to stop Wembanyama and get ahead of it. So because of that, someone like Zach Edey is going to go far. Now with Sacramento, he's not a shooter at the moment. I think if he shot out to the mid-range, you can make it work really well. And he probably can, because he shot 74% from the line, which for a big man like him, any 7-footer is pretty good, let alone 7'4", but also he had ridiculous volume. So that number probably should be higher if it was lower volume. So I think with him, he definitely can play on an NBA court. Can he play starter minutes? Unclear. I don't think he's this, like, he's not Taco Fall. Taco Fall was there because he was tall and didn't know how to play.
Right.
Zach Edey knows how to play basketball. He is very smart. He has skills that weren't being able to be shown at Purdue, because why did they need to when you could just live in the post?
Right. So 2 final questions for you, both of them completely out of left field. So, and I have not run these by you before because they popped into my brain during this conversation. I want to take you back to last year's draft. Colby Jones, Sacramento they actually moved up in the second round to take him. Some people were surprised that Colby Jones even fell and was there in the very beginning of the second round. Colby Jones is someone that I think many, myself included in Sacramento, are hoping can continue to develop and continue to translate, because he has those measurements, he has that size, and he has that skill set to really help Sacramento. But I don't know what that timeline looks like. Going back to just your thoughts of Colby Jones coming into last year's draft and the type of player that he is, What's your overall opinion of him? Because I didn't talk to anybody about him before last year's draft.
Yeah, I liked him. I had some concerns about the shot, especially because I saw him at his pro day hit the side of the backboard from the corner a few times, but I still gave him a high second round grade. Ultimately, I had him 33 on my board, which I feel like was a pretty nice ranking. And the thing for me is just if that shot comes along, I'm there. I really do think he's a good project to be invested in because he's a do-it-all guy. He just needs that one final piece to get there.
I think we're hoping for some big noticeable jumps in the California Classic and in Summer League this year from him. Hopefully he can have maybe not necessarily as good of a Keegan Murray California Classic as last year where Keegan was going for 50, but if Colby can play well in the Classic and not even have to play in Las Vegas, that would be pretty great because the Kings are looking for a lot from him. Finally, this has nothing to do with the Kings, but I'm of the belief, like you have 2 forfeited picks in the second round. You have the 76ers and Phoenix Suns forfeited picks in the second round. I understand the league uses it as a punishment towards teams for tampering violations and things like that. Ultimately, I feel like it harms players. Although on the flip side of that, it gives 2 more players the opportunity as an undrafted free agent to pick where they go. And we saw in the case of Keon Ellis, how great that worked out for him. He picked an organization that needed a player like him, and he went from a two-way guy to a starter in the play-in for Sacramento, and he's not going anywhere anytime soon. What is your opinion and your feeling on forfeited picks and how they impact the players more than they impact the teams?
Yeah, I'm kind of against it. I feel like they should just auction it off. Like, why not? Because there are 2 kids now that, like, this is their dream. Every single person who has ever liked any sport, whatever sport it is, they dream as a kid. They go, what if I got to hear my name called on the NBA or NBA, NFL, NHL, MLB draft, whatever it is? You want to hear that. And now 2 kids don't get that opportunity, even if it's nothing, even if it's someone like, and I apologize to this man for who's about to catch a stray, but like, even if it's Colton Iverson, who never plays in the NBA, right? Like, it's still that opportunity to say, hey, I was drafted. And like, okay, if they wanted to choose their path, you can still do that. Trace Jackson Davis had offers in the 40s, but he told teams, hey, do not draft me. Obviously, Tyrese Halliburton did that 4 years ago, and that was in the first round. But guys tell teams, don't draft me. I'm going to pick my own route after a certain point. That can still happen. There are other players that don't want to do that and can, easily say, hey, I'm just happy to be drafted and given an opportunity. I think it's really dumb. It's got to change because it's going to happen every year too. Like tampering is normal now.
Yeah, as if contract talks are already happening with Malik Monk and everybody who's a free agent right now. And I mean, it's just the NBA, right? Just the state of where we're at. Well, Richard, it's coming up, man. The draft is coming up in a handful of weeks. I know you're going to keep building and building and building. What can people expect from you in the build-up in the final days and weeks before the draft itself? And then even on draft night, what can, whether it's Locked On listeners or just to NBA fans in general, what can they get from you?
Yeah, I do. I'm dropping a new big board. I got one more after that, which will be the final 1-year draft day. I do NBA level scouting reports and then also community mocks, which I need to have you back on again soon, Matt. But also Locked On NBA Big Board. Yeah, that's where we'll on draft night. I'm still unsure if I'm going to the draft. If you can't tell, my bookshelf is empty and I'm moving. So unclear how much time will permit for that. But at the minimum, I'll be doing the draft show on Locked On.
Well, Richard, I appreciate you taking the time, my man, here, especially right before moving to come on Locked On Kings and give us some of your share some of your draft wisdom with us. I appreciate it, brother, and hopefully we'll be able to chat very, very soon.